A 6-year-old girl offered to clean a millionaire's shoes in exchange for his leftovers. What he did next changed both their lives forever. Brian West was tired. Not in the way a man gets after a long day at the office, but the kind of tired that settles deep inside, the kind that doesn't go away with a weekend off or a glass of expensive whiskey. He had everything, more than most people could dream of. A sprawling office in a glass tower, billions in the bank, and the kind of respect that made people pause before speaking to him. But none of it made him feel alive anymore. That afternoon, he told his assistant to clear his schedule. No calls. No meetings. No explanations. He got in his sleek black car and drove. No destination in mind, just away. Away from polished boardrooms, away from deadlines and projections, away from the artificial smiles. An hour later, he ended up at a small roadside cafe nestled between pine trees. It looked like it hadn't changed in decades. The sign squeaked in the breeze, and the paint on the walls had started to peel. It was perfect. Brian took a seat by the window, his light blue suit standing out like royalty in exile. He ordered coffee and a sandwich, hoping the quiet would stay with him a little longer. The scent of pine and fresh bread drifted through the air, and for a brief moment, he felt something close to peace. No one recognized him there. No one cared who he was. That's why he had come. But just as he took his second sip of coffee, something interrupted the stillness. He noticed a movement near the corner of the cafe. A small figure, out of place, almost like a shadow. She was a little girl, no more than 6 years old. Her hair was a messy halo of blonde curls, her cheeks smudged with dirt, and her clothes hung awkwardly on her tiny frame. A gray t-shirt with faint food stains, and a denim skirt that looked like it had seen too many days. In her hands she held two things, a yellow cleaning rag and a worn-out shoe brush. Her blue eyes locked onto Brian's for a moment, cautious but determined. She approached his table quietly, like someone used to being ignored or shooed away. Then, standing by his chair, she looked up at him and spoke in a voice that was soft but steady. "Sir, can I clean your shoes?" she asked. "And then, maybe eat whatever you don't finish? I'm really hungry." Brian froze. For a second, he didn't understand what he was hearing. The words were simple, but they felt like a punch. This was not some street corner in a war-torn country. This was America. A child. Offering to polish a stranger's shoes for leftovers. He looked at her face. She wasn't begging. She wasn't crying. She was offering work. In exchange for scraps. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and suddenly, the sandwich in front of him lost all meaning. He didn't respond right away. The air around him seemed heavier. He had signed billion-dollar deals, had shaken hands with presidents, but he had no idea what to say to a 6-year-old girl asking for a bite to eat. "I'll order you something," he said at last, gently. The girl shook her head. "I can't take anything unless I earn it. My mom always says, nothing comes free." And just like that, his whole world shifted. The silence between them lingered, heavy and fragile, as if the world had paused to see what Brian West would do next. He looked at the girl, so small, yet carrying the weight of something far older than her years. Her hands clutched the rag and brushed tightly, like tools of survival. She didn't flinch under his gaze. She stood there with a quiet kind of dignity, not pleading, not demanding, just offering something in return for food she hadn't tasted yet. There was something haunting in that, and something deeply admirable. Brian leaned back in his chair, trying to understand the enormity of this moment. He had built his entire life around control, logic, and efficiency. But nothing about this encounter followed rules. He gestured gently toward the chair across from him. "Sit," he said, his voice softer than usual, trying not to scare her off. She didn't move right away. She looked down at the floor, then back at him, uncertain. You don't have to clean anything. Just sit and eat. I'll take care of it, he said, waving to the waitress. The girl remained standing. Her jaw tightened a little, and her voice came again, quiet but insistent. I really can't. If I don't do something for it, I'm not allowed to take it. She held her chin a little higher, almost defiantly, though there was a tremble in her lip that betrayed how hungry she really was. Brian's heart twisted in a way he hadn't felt in years. He nodded slowly. All right, he said, picking up his briefcase from the floor and placing it on his lap. You can wipe the dust off this if you'd like. It's been sitting under my desk too long. Her eyes lit up, just barely, as if that small task gave her permission to sit down. She reached out and gently wiped the leather case with her yellow cloth, moving carefully, precisely, like she'd done this 100 times before. It was symbolic more than necessary, but to her, it seemed to mean everything. While she worked, Brian flagged down the waitress, who had been eyeing the situation from behind the counter with a puzzled look. Can I get a bowl of soup, a slice of pizza, and a chocolate milkshake? For her, he said, nodding at the girl. The waitress looked unsure. You sure, sir? Brian's tone changed slightly, more firm now. Yes. And whatever she doesn't finish, box it to go. The girl didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the case, polishing a corner that didn't need polishing. Her small hands were rough and slightly red, the kind you'd expect from someone who knew more about cleaning supplies than crayons. When the food arrived, she looked at it as though it might disappear if she blinked. She didn't dive in. Instead, she glanced at Brian with hesitation. Is it okay now? She asked. He nodded. You've earned it. That seemed to satisfy something inside her, and she picked up the spoon and began to eat, not ravenously, but with surprising self-control, as if even now she felt she had to prove herself. Brian watched her eat. Every motion was careful, restrained. She didn't speak much between bites, but when she did, her voice had a strange combination of maturity and innocence. You smell like books, she said once. He blinked. Books? She nodded with a mouthful of soup, then added, and maybe cologne. The kind rich people wear. There was no judgment in her tone, just an observation, stated plainly. He chuckled, despite himself. Is that a bad thing? She shook her head. No. It's just. I don't usually sit with people like you. Her words were honest, but carried no malice. It was just her world, her reality. Brian tried to smile, but he felt like his face had forgotten how to do it right. What's your name? He asked after a pause. Emma, she replied without hesitation. Emma James. He repeated it in his head, marking it there like something he didn't want to forget. Nice to meet you, Emma. I'm Brian. She nodded, then went back to eating. The milkshake left a smear of chocolate on her upper lip, which she didn't notice. A few moments passed before he asked the question he already feared the answer to. Where's your mom? Emma didn't respond at first. She focused on the pizza, nibbling at the crust. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before. She's in a hospital. She's sick. The doctors said she's gonna die soon. They said she won't make it to Christmas. Brian's throat tightened. The way she said it, flat, almost factual, made it even harder to hear. I was in a group home, she continued, still not looking up. They said I couldn't visit her again because I ran away too many times. But she's my mom. So I left. I found the hospital on my own. I saw her through the glass once. She was sleeping. Then I left again. I didn't want them to find me. They always take me back. She looked up then, her blue eyes filled with something ancient. I just wanted to be near her. That's all. Brian didn't know what to say. No business deal had ever left him this speechless. No merger, no lawsuit, no boardroom ambush could have prepared him for this little girl and her broken but brave heart. He felt the beginnings of something deep and unfamiliar stir inside him. Responsibility? Guilt? Compassion? Maybe all of them. But more than anything, he felt a quiet clarity. This wasn't going to be just a meal. Not for her. And not for him. Brian didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in the corner of his vast living room, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace that he rarely used. The silence in his house, once comforting, now pressed on him like a weight. He kept thinking about the girl, Emma, about her voice, her eyes, her small hands gripping that yellow rag like it was the only thing tethering her to the world. He replayed every word she had said, over and over, the same way he used to analyze financial deals, but this was different. This wasn't numbers. This was something raw, something real. She had slipped into his life without warning, without permission, and now she was in his thoughts like she belonged there. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Brian was already on the phone. He called a private investigator he had used for high-stakes corporate security issues, someone discreet and thorough. "I need everything you can find on an Emma James," he said, giving the approximate age and hospital location she had mentioned. 6 years old. Mother's name is Sarah. Priority 1. I need answers today. The man didn't ask questions. He was used to unusual requests, but even so, there was something different in Brian's tone that morning, an urgency laced with emotion. While he waited for results, Brian canceled all his meetings. His assistant was stunned but didn't press. No one ever questioned him. That had always been the rule. Still, he caught people staring at him as he paced through the office halls, his expression darker, more distant than usual. He didn't care. By noon, his phone rang. The investigator's voice was crisp, efficient, but Brian could tell even he was shaken. Emma James. Found her. Born in Chicago. Mother's name is Sarah James, single parent. Medical records confirm terminal illness, stage 4 cancer, liver and lung involvement. She's at County Hospice, room 214, under palliative care. No known father on record. As for Emma, she's technically a ward of the state. She's been placed in and out of group homes since her mother was hospitalized 7 months ago. Ran away twice. Last disappearance was reported 3 days ago. She's listed as missing. Brian gripped the phone tighter. He turned toward the window, not wanting anyone to see the emotion creeping into his face. And no one's looking for her. There's a notice, but she's not a priority. There are dozens like her. Dozens like her. That sentence echoed through him like a curse. He hung up without a word, grabbed his coat, and left the building. No driver this time. He wanted to be alone, to process, to move. When he arrived at the hospice, the smell of antiseptic and the quiet hum of machines greeted him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't been in a hospital in years, not since his mother died when he was in his 20s. The memories hit him hard, but he pushed them aside and asked for Sarah James. The nurse at the desk looked him up and down skeptically. His tailored coat, polished shoes, and clipped speech didn't match the usual visitors, but she led him down the hall anyway. Room 214 was dimly lit. A frail woman lay in the bed, her face pale and sunken, but there was something unmistakable in her features. She looked like Emma, same shape of the eyes, same curve in the jawline. Her breathing was shallow but steady. She wasn't asleep, just resting with her eyes closed. Brian hesitated before stepping in. What was he even doing here? This wasn't business. This wasn't calculated. This was uncharted territory. He stood there until her eyes opened slowly. She blinked a few times, adjusting to the figure at the door. Her voice was a dry whisper. "If you're from the social office, I already signed everything." Brian took a careful step forward. "I'm not from the system," he said. I met your daughter." Her eyes sharpened immediately, despite her weakness. "Emma? Where is she? Is she okay?" "She's safe," he said quickly. "She came to me yesterday. In a cafe. She was trying to earn food by cleaning shoes." Sarah let out a dry, pained laugh that turned into a cough. "Of course she did," she said between gasps. "That's my girl. Always trying to fight the world her own way." Brian stepped closer. "I wanted to see you. I wanted to understand." Sarah looked at him, trying to read who he was. "Why? Who are you?" "My name is Brian West. I run a company. I don't usually do things like this. But your daughter, she's different. She's brave. She has more character than most adults I've met." Sarah smiled faintly, her face lined with sadness and pride. "She's had to grow up faster than any child should. I tried to protect her, but there's only so much I could do with what we had." Brian nodded, and then he said something he hadn't planned, something that surprised even himself. "If I could help her. I mean, really help her, would you let me?" Sarah stared at him for a long time. There was no fear in her eyes, only a tired kind of hope. "You want to take her in?" "I don't know what it will look like yet," he said honestly. "But I can promise this, she won't be alone. She won't be in the system anymore." A tear slipped from the corner of Sarah's eye. "If you mean that, then yes. Yes. Please. Just promise me she'll be loved. Don't let her become invisible again." Brian nodded, his throat tight. "I promise." That night, as he left the hospice, he looked up at the sky. For the first time in years, it didn't feel so empty. He didn't have all the answers. But he had made a promise. And he intended to keep it. Brian didn't go home that evening. Instead, he sat in his car outside the hospice for almost an hour, staring at the dashboard without really seeing it. The conversation with Sarah had left something behind in him, something sharp and undeniable. Her eyes, full of resignation but also an aching trust, replayed in his mind. She had nothing left to offer but her daughter, and she had given that final piece of her heart to a man she had known for less than an hour. And still, somehow, it felt right. It felt like a moment that wasn't random, like a door opening not just for Emma, but for him too. He picked up his phone and made the first of many calls. His lawyer was shocked by the request. Brian had never shown any personal interest in children, let alone parenthood. But this wasn't business, and Brian didn't care how unusual it sounded. He asked for everything necessary to begin the process: temporary guardianship, background checks, home assessments. His name, his resources, his reputation, he would use it all to keep that promise. The next morning, he returned to the cafe where he had first met Emma. He wasn't sure she'd still be there, but part of him hoped she would be. When he walked in, the owner recognized him immediately and pointed toward the back of the shop, where Emma was curled up in the corner of the booth, her knees pulled up to her chest, a paper napkin covering her eyes like a failed attempt to hide from the world. She looked up when she heard footsteps, and for a brief second, her eyes filled with fear. Then recognition. Then confusion. "You came back," she said cautiously, as though testing a reality she didn't quite believe in. Brian nodded and sat across from her, speaking gently. "Your mom's still holding on. She asked me to take care of you. Would that be okay?" Emma looked down, gripping the edge of her skirt. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You don't have to. I can manage." "I know you can," he said. "But you shouldn't have to." She didn't respond right away. Her body was still tense, ready to run if this turned out to be a trick. But there was something in his eyes she trusted, something steady. "Will I still have to clean shoes?" she asked. Brian smiled softly, a smile that came from a place in him that had been dormant for years. "Only if you really like cleaning shoes. But otherwise, no. You'll have your own room, your own bed, and food that doesn't come with conditions." Emma didn't say yes or no. She just nodded, once, and stood up. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't ask what came next. She just followed him. When they arrived at his house, a large, sleek building with more glass than walls, Emma paused at the front door. Her face turned uncertain, and she didn't step inside. Instead, she looked up at him and said, "Are there other people inside?" "Yes," Brian said. "Some staff. But no children. Just you." She nodded again, and only then did she step in, slowly, as if afraid she might break something. The marble floors, the quiet hum of central heating, the smell of polished wood, it was a different planet. She took it all in with wide eyes, but said nothing. He showed her a guest room that had been cleaned and prepared while he was away. The bed was far too big for someone so small, and the soft pillows looked untouched. She walked up to the edge of the bed and stared at it. Then, almost shyly, she asked, "Is this mine?" "For as long as you want it to be," he said. She didn't climb onto the bed right away. Instead, she sat on the floor next to it, hugging her knees. Brian didn't know what to do, so he sat with her in silence. After a while, she said, "I think my mom is going to die soon." He didn't know how to respond. He wanted to promise that things would be okay, but he couldn't lie to her. Instead, he said, "I know. But she wanted to make sure you wouldn't be alone." Emma nodded. "She always told me to be strong. That nobody was coming to save us. But now, it feels different." Brian took a deep breath. "Maybe it is." That night, as Emma finally lay down in the bed, fully clothed and curled up on one side like a curled leaf, Brian stood in the doorway for a long time, watching over her. Something had shifted inside him. For most of his life, his focus had been on success, on climbing ladders and collecting wins. But now, sitting in a quiet house with a little girl sleeping in the next room, success felt meaningless compared to the promise he had made to a dying mother. And somewhere in that quiet, he began to believe that maybe this wasn't just about rescuing her. Maybe she was rescuing him too. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet kind of urgency. Brian had never filled out so many forms in his life, and yet none of it felt tedious. There were documents to sign, interviews to attend, social workers to speak with, and home visits to schedule. His house, though pristine and fully staffed, was suddenly under a microscope. Every corner was examined, every drawer checked, every staff member questioned. Brian didn't argue. He welcomed it. He wanted them to see that he wasn't trying to collect a child like a new asset, he was trying to build something real, something stable for a girl who had never had it. Emma didn't fully understand what was happening at first. She knew there were meetings, that people came and asked her questions in soft, rehearsed voices, the kind used with traumatized children. She responded politely but without much trust. She still kept her distance, always watching, always waiting for the moment when it would all disappear. Brian could see it in the way she never unpacked the small bag she had brought with her, the way she refused to pick out clothes from the wardrobe he had stocked, the way she slept with her shoes on for the first week. She didn't believe permanence existed. Every morning, she was awake before sunrise. She would creep down to the kitchen and sit silently at the edge of the island, waiting for someone to notice her. The staff didn't know how to interact with her at first. They were used to a quiet house where everything had a place and a schedule. Emma didn't fit into that world easily. She asked questions no one expected: how much the silverware cost, whether she could keep a fork if she cleaned it, if she could work in the garden in exchange for lunch. It unsettled everyone at first, but Brian made it clear that she was never to be treated like a guest, or worse, a problem. She was home now, whether she believed it yet or not. He tried to create routines for her, something steady to anchor her to the idea that she belonged. Breakfast together, a short walk in the garden, simple board games in the evening. Sometimes she joined in, other times she simply watched. There were days when she barely spoke, and days when she asked 100 questions in a row. Once, during dinner, she suddenly looked up and asked, "How many kids do rich people usually have?" Brian was caught off guard, but he smiled and answered honestly, "I don't know. I never really thought about having any." She considered that for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe just one is enough," she said, then returned to eating as if nothing had happened. It stayed with him all night. The temporary guardianship was approved quickly, likely due to his influence and resources, but also because the system didn't have many better options. Still, the social worker assigned to the case visited regularly, checking in on Emma's adjustment and probing Brian's motivations with clinical precision. One afternoon, she asked him directly, "Why her? You don't have children. You never applied to foster. You're a high-profile corporate figure with a busy schedule. Why now?" Brian thought for a long time before answering. "Because I looked into her eyes and saw someone doing everything she could to survive in a world that never gave her a single break. And for the first time in my life, I realized I could do something that mattered." The social worker said nothing for a moment, then made a few notes and quietly left. Later, she would write in her report that while Brian West didn't fit the typical mold of a caregiver, there was no mistaking the sincerity of his commitment. Meanwhile, Emma began to change, slowly, like a flower learning it was safe to bloom. She stopped sleeping in her shoes. She started drawing, not with expensive markers, but with hotel pens and sticky notes she found around the office. She would bring Brian little folded scraps with strange doodles, lopsided houses, suns with sunglasses, a giraffe that looked like a cloud. He kept them all. Not out of politeness, but because each one felt like a message from a world he had never known he needed. Then came the day Sarah James passed away. It was early morning when the hospice called. Brian answered the phone himself. He sat in silence afterward, holding the receiver long after the line went dead. Emma found him in the living room, still in his robe, eyes red but dry. She didn't ask what had happened. She looked at his face, saw the truth, and simply sat beside him without a word. They didn't speak for an hour. They didn't need to. Later that day, Brian told her gently, "Your mom's not hurting anymore." She passed peacefully. Emma didn't cry. She just nodded and whispered, "I already knew." That night, she crawled into Brian's bed without asking, curled up next to him like a lost animal finally finding warmth. He wrapped his arm around her, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. The following weeks brought a quiet stillness, not heavy, but grounding. Emma slowly began to unpack her things. She started calling the house staff by their names. She tried wearing slippers instead of shoes to bed. It wasn't perfect, there were still nightmares, days when she refused to eat, mornings where she stood at the door, ready to run, but she always came back. Always looked for Brian first. And he was always there. By the time a month had passed, the house had begun to change in ways Brian hadn't expected. It wasn't just that Emma was there, it was how her presence seemed to slowly unravel the cold structure of his life. Things that had once felt permanent, like silence, perfection, and routine, were now softening, becoming flexible, human. The once sterile rooms filled with traces of her, crayon marks on the edges of paper napkins, a pair of socks that never made it to the laundry basket, and the faint sound of humming that drifted from the hallway when she thought no one was listening. And yet, even as the surface changed, Emma's deeper habits remained, scars of her survival instinct. She never accepted a gift without trying to earn it. If Brian brought home a new book or stuffed animal, she'd say, "Can I wash the dishes for this? Or, I'll fold towels if I keep it." He tried gently, repeatedly, to explain that she didn't need to trade kindness for care, but it was embedded in her bones. She had learned that nothing came without a price, and it would take more than comfort to unlearn that. She also flinched at loud noises. If someone dropped a plate, she would immediately look around as if danger was imminent. The first time the gardener raised his voice calling out to a coworker, Emma had disappeared for an hour. Brian found her hiding in the laundry room behind a basket of linens. She hadn't cried. She had just gone silent, frozen in that old habit of waiting for the world to punish her. He sat on the floor beside her, not asking questions, not giving speeches. He just waited until she reached for his hand. It became clear to Brian that he couldn't navigate this journey alone. So he reached out to a child psychologist, Dr. Lauren Mead, a quiet woman with warm eyes and a voice that never rushed. Emma didn't like her at first. She thought therapy was some kind of test. But Dr. Mead never asked her to sit still or speak on command. Instead, she brought puzzles and sand trays, giving Emma the space to express herself in ways she could control. Slowly, Emma began to talk, just a little. Sometimes she'd describe stories about animals who had no homes. Other times she'd draw maps of imaginary towns where lost kids built their own cities. Dr. Mead always listened without interrupting, and that made all the difference. Brian learned, too. He read books at night about trauma and child development, filled the margins with notes, and often showed up to sessions with more questions than answers. He stopped working late and started adjusting his schedule so he could pick Emma up from school when she started attending part-time. The office staff was stunned the first time he left a meeting early, saying simply, "My daughter's waiting." Some looked confused. A few smiled. But no one questioned him. School was its own challenge. Emma struggled with the other children. She was quiet, hesitant, and older in ways they couldn't understand. When another girl took her eraser without asking, Emma didn't tell the teacher. She just shut down, refusing to speak for the rest of the day. Brian got a call and came straight to the school. He didn't scold her. He just asked what had happened. Emma didn't say much, but she leaned into his side, and he took that as progress. At home, she was beginning to test boundaries. Once, she spilled juice on the rug and panicked, trying to scrub it out before anyone noticed. When Brian saw her, she looked up with terror in her eyes, expecting to be yelled at or punished. But he only knelt down and handed her a towel. "Accidents happen," he said. She blinked, confused. "You're not mad?" He shook his head. "No. I'm just glad you told me." That moment changed something. From then on, she stopped hiding small mistakes. She started asking for help. There were good days, too, days when she laughed so hard her stomach hurt, when she danced in her socks across the smooth floor of the hallway, when she made Brian wear a paper crown during their board game night and called him King Bee. On one of those nights, while they were eating popcorn on the couch, she said, "You know, I didn't think rich people ever sat on the floor." He smiled and replied, "We don't usually. But I'm not the same kind of rich person anymore." She nodded seriously. "You're the kind who knows where the laundry room is." As time passed, the house became less of a mansion and more of a home. Brian noticed things in himself that he never had before: patience, protectiveness, even joy in the smallest routines. He found himself checking on her before bed, even after she'd already fallen asleep, just to make sure she was still there, still safe, still breathing softly. And Emma, though still cautious and shaped by her past, began to allow herself the fragile possibility of trust. Not complete yet, but forming. Like a flower just beginning to believe in spring. The morning the adoption was finalized, Brian stood in front of the courthouse in a gray suit that felt more meaningful than any he'd ever worn in his life. The air was cool, the sky unusually clear, and the moment carried a kind of quiet gravity. Emma stood next to him, wearing a simple blue dress she had chosen herself, along with a pair of white sneakers that squeaked softly with every step. Her hair was combed back into a low ponytail, but a few stubborn curls had broken free and framed her face. She held on to his hand tightly, not out of fear, but out of something new, certainty. She didn't say much that morning, and neither did he. Words felt too small for everything this day meant. Inside, the courtroom was mostly empty except for a few staff, the social worker, the judge, and Brian's attorney. Emma sat beside him at the long wooden table, swinging her legs under the bench. She had been told what to expect, but she still glanced around the room with the caution of someone who had learned to read the tone of spaces long before she could read books. The judge, an older woman with silver glasses and a kind expression, asked her a few gentle questions: her name, how long she'd been staying with Brian, what she liked to do in her free time. Emma answered each one politely, her voice clear and steady, her posture perfectly straight. When the judge finally smiled and said, "From this day forward, your legal name will be Emma West," Brian felt a knot loosen in his chest that he hadn't even known was there. As they walked out of the building, the sun was higher in the sky and Emma's grip had relaxed. She looked up at him and asked, "So now I'm really yours?" Brian nodded. "You always were," he said. "This just makes it official." She didn't smile right away. Instead, she looked thoughtful, almost analytical, like she was measuring the truth of his words against all the disappointments she'd known. Then she quietly replied, "Okay." That was all. But for Emma, it meant everything. That afternoon, they returned home to a quiet celebration. Brian hadn't wanted anything too loud or overwhelming, knowing how Emma felt about crowds. But he had arranged for a cake, balloons, and a small gathering in the garden with just the house staff and Dr. Meade. There were no speeches, no grand declarations, just warmth. Emma didn't run around or shout with excitement. Instead, she took it all in slowly, like someone learning how to feel safe in joy. Later that evening, Brian took her to his study, a space Emma had always respected like it was off limits. This time, he opened the door and motioned for her to come in. She stepped carefully inside, scanning the shelves of books and framed certificates, until her eyes landed on something new hanging on the wall. A simple glass frame. Inside it, neatly arranged, were a small yellow cleaning rag and an old shoe brush. Below them, a small brass plaque read, "The day everything changed." Not because of the shoes, but because of who held them. Emma stared at it for a long time. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You kept them." Brian nodded. "I wanted to remember how it started. How lucky I was to meet you." She didn't respond right away. She walked over to the wall, looked up at the frame again, and said softly, "I thought I was just surviving that day. I didn't think I was doing something important." Brian knelt beside her. "You were showing me what courage looks like." From that day on, the brush and rag became more than just artifacts. They were a reminder, not of poverty or struggle, but of the exact moment their lives collided and changed forever. Whenever Brian looked at them, he didn't see a desperate little girl offering labor for food. He saw a fighter, a soul too bright to be ignored, a child who held on to dignity even when she had nothing else. In the weeks that followed, the bond between them deepened in small, daily ways. Emma began to call him Dad for the first time, not every time, but occasionally, and always softly, like testing a word that had once belonged to someone else. Brian never pushed it. He just answered every time she said it, as though he had always been waiting to hear it. They developed traditions together. Friday night pancakes became a thing, even when it wasn't breakfast time. They kept a jar in the kitchen labeled Dreams, where they both wrote down places they wanted to visit or things they wanted to do. Emma's first note was ice skating. Brian's was learn how to braid hair. They laughed when they read each other's slips, but neither of them forgot. They went skating the next weekend, and Brian, after several attempts and a few YouTube videos, actually learned to braid. There were still moments when shadows returned. Nights when Emma would wake up crying, moments when loud sounds triggered her old instincts, or when new people made her go quiet again. But those moments became fewer. They were no longer a constant storm. They were passing clouds. And Emma, who once only measured safety in terms of silence and invisibility, began to understand something new: permanence. One evening, she was sitting on the back porch, feet dangling off the edge of a bench, watching the garden as the sun dipped behind the trees. Brian joined her, setting 2 mugs of cocoa down on the table. She took hers without a word, blew on it, and sipped. After a while, she asked, "Do you think I'll ever forget what it was like before?" Brian considered that for a moment. "Maybe not forget. But it'll stop being what defines you." Emma looked down into her cup. "That sounds nice." Then she leaned against his arm, resting her head there like it was the most natural thing in the world. He placed his hand gently over hers, and for a while, they just watched the sky shift from gold to blue. She didn't need to hear she was safe anymore. She believed it. The year that followed was filled with changes neither of them could have predicted, the kind of changes that slowly alter the fabric of a life, not through grand gestures but through quiet, consistent transformation. Brian's home, once an echoing monument to solitude and success, had become a place where light stayed on longer than needed, where the smell of pancakes mixed with the scent of fresh laundry, and where laughter, soft at first, then more confident, had taken up permanent residence. Emma was growing, not just in height but in spirit. She walked with more assurance, spoke with more ease, and no longer flinched when someone praised her. Her walls were still there, but they were becoming windows. Brian changed too. His work no longer consumed his identity. He still ran the company, still made major decisions, but his priorities had shifted. He scheduled meetings around Emma's school events. He turned down speaking engagements if they conflicted with their weekend plans. At first, his board of directors raised eyebrows, but as profits remained steady and his leadership steadied further, even his most skeptical colleagues couldn't deny that something in him had improved. He was no longer just focused, he was grounded. One afternoon, after a routine investor briefing, Brian sat in his office looking out over the city, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. On the edge of his desk was a photo Emma had taken with a disposable camera from a field trip to the botanical gardens. The picture was slightly blurry, off-center, and filled with color. She had called it a photo of nothing, but Brian kept it framed. It reminded him that beauty often lived in the things we overlook. That same week, while going through old boxes in the garage, Emma found a small suitcase filled with Brian's childhood things. There was a worn baseball glove, a few faded report cards, and a crumpled essay titled, "What I Want to Be When I Grow Up." He had written, "I want to build things that last." She brought it to him with a smile and said, "I think you did." Her voice was soft, but there was something sure in it. He looked at her and nodded, feeling the truth of it settle deep. Inspired by Emma's resilience and their shared journey, Brian started thinking bigger, beyond just their home. He had always been a strategist, someone who could see patterns in markets and people. Now, he applied that skill to something that mattered more to him than any stock trend. He began to research youth homelessness, foster care gaps, and programs that failed children like Emma. What he found angered him. Thousands of children, many with stories just like hers, slipping through cracks that had been left unattended for decades. One evening, he told Emma over dinner, "I think we should start something. Something to help kids like you were, kids who don't get lucky, who don't meet someone by accident in a cafe." Emma looked at him curiously. "Like what?" He paused, then replied, "A foundation. One that gives children tools to build their own futures. Skills, education, mentorship, real chances." Emma sat quietly for a moment, then said, "Can we call it Emma's Hands?" He blinked. "Why that name?" She smiled. "Because my hands cleaned your shoes that day. But now they're building something better." He reached across the table and took her hand in his. Emma's hands it is. The launch of the foundation was modest, on purpose. Brian didn't want cameras or headlines. He wanted results. Over the next several months, he built a team of educators, counselors, and former foster youth who helped shape the program. They opened a small center on the west side of the city, a welcoming space filled with books, laptops, art supplies, and a garden in the back. Emma visited every week, planting herbs and talking to the younger kids who reminded her of herself. She didn't like the word mentor, but that's exactly what she was becoming. Then came the fundraiser. Brian hadn't planned on doing a formal event, but donors wanted to see the vision up close. Reluctantly, he agreed, but only on one condition, that Emma would help him present. She was nervous. She practiced in front of mirrors, in front of Dr. Mead, even in the kitchen while pancakes were cooking. On the night of the event, she wore a soft white dress and stood behind the podium with her hands folded, her eyes scanning the crowd of adults in suits and pearls. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but unwavering. "I used to think I had to trade something to deserve kindness," she began. "I thought work had to come first. That you had to earn food, or safety, or love. But someone taught me that being seen, truly seen, doesn't have to be earned. It just has to be offered." The room fell silent, not out of politeness, but because no one had expected truth to come from a child. She paused, then continued. "This place, Emma's hands, isn't mine. It's theirs. For every kid who thinks their story doesn't matter. It does. We all do." When she finished, the applause wasn't loud, it was long. A rising, unbroken wave of appreciation that brought more than one guest to tears. Brian stood beside her the entire time, not needing to say anything. She had spoken for both of them. That night, as they drove home, Emma leaned her head against the window. The city lights blurred past, but her expression was calm. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" she asked softly. Brian reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "I know she would be." Later, as she fell asleep upstairs, Brian walked into his study and looked at the framed rag and brush one more time. It no longer reminded him of tragedy. It reminded him of the start of something unbreakable. He turned off the light and stood in the hallway for a while, listening to the soft rhythm of a child's breath behind a closed door, a sound more powerful than any deal he had ever closed. Everything had changed. And somehow, it had all begun with the smallest voice, the simplest offer, and a single act of dignity. He hadn't saved her. She had saved them both. This story isn't just about a lost child finding a home, it's about what happens when two broken lives collide in the right moment, and instead of more damage, there's healing. Emma didn't need saving in the traditional sense. She needed someone to see her, to choose her, not out of pity, but out of love. And Brian, a man who had everything but connection, didn't just give her a second chance, she gave him one too. What makes this ending powerful is its honesty. It doesn't pretend that healing is instant or easy. It shows that trust takes time, that love can be quiet, and that the most meaningful changes often begin in silence, in a small moment, with a rag, a brush, and a little girl refusing to be invisible. The final truth is this: no one is ever too small to matter, and no life is ever too far gone to begin again.